Hi there. In this lecture, I just want to talk a little bit about what firms are and, more importantly, why firms exist from an economic perspective. So, why do economists believe that firms exist? Which is an interesting question because you might say, well, why wouldn't they exist? But if we think about the power of the price mechanism and the importance and usefulness of markets, then one obvious question is why don't we use markets for everything? The fact that we don't use markets for everything, the fact that we sometimes use firms to organize economic activity is an interesting question worth addressing. Now, there's different types of business, so and this can depend on different countries. So if you have a law course, you'll probably get a better overview than I have here. But we can think of proprietorships, for example, where the owner is a residual claimant on the value of the business. It means that they have the right to the profits that are generated by the company, but they're also responsible for any debts. Partnerships are where we have two or more individuals with ownership rights. Or corporation is where liability is limited to the amount invested within the company, and the benefit of this means that ownership is easily transferable. And so there's a benefit here in terms of risk profiling. There's also a downside in terms of the control that you might have in terms of ownership, but also management. Back in 2008, I contributed to a policy report with some of my colleagues at the London campus at ESCP called Enterprising Britain. Next couple of charts are using data from that. So it's a little bit out of date now, but a lot of work went into it, and it was a report that generated some significant media coverage, which is always something that academics are proud to receive. And so I just went back through that report to find some of the work that we'd done. One of the things that we found was that for any new business that's created, there's about 70% survival rate for the UK, which implies that 30% of businesses fail within 36 months. Of those companies that survive, around 10% go on to become high growth firms, whereas 90% of them have either no or modest growth. And so when we think about survival rates, and I'm sure you're familiar with the data that says that so many new businesses fail, what we're really interested in here is not so much the distinction between modest growth and failure, but what are the probability that we have a high growth firm. High growth businesses, in other words, businesses that grow at a rate of over 30%, are the top 10%. 33 companies in our study had a growth rate equal or higher than 100% in the last 3 years. So there was 33 companies that had dramatically high growth rates. And there were only 15 companies that reached a 10 million revenue within 5 years. So these are sometimes known as gazelle companies. And I think it's interesting how when we were doing this analysis, it was quite cutting edge. I think that we've seen research follow us in this direction, which is instead of just looking at survival versus failure, it's looking at where are the gazelles, where are the high growth companies. It's one thing to survive, but it's another thing to prosper. And there's a very small number of companies, and it's very low chances of becoming one of these high growth firms. In terms of the firm data for the UK, and again, this is historic data, but if we look at the number turnover and number of employees, the analysis that we did here in terms of small companies, medium companies, large companies, we found that 99.2%, so if I just annotate this to make it a little bit clearer for you, we found that 99% of companies were small. In fact, 73% of companies had 0 employees. So 73% of companies have no employees, 99% have less than 50 employees, 0.6% of companies are medium-sized, and only 0.2% of companies are large. Now that's in terms of the number of companies. If we look about things in terms of the turnover being generated, then we see that although 99% of UK companies were small, they only generated 36% of revenues. And even though there is only 0.2% of large companies, they accounted for almost 50% of revenue. We can also look at a breakdown in terms of the number of employees. So if we think that one of the importance of UK company growth is the fact that they employ people, 46.8% of people work for companies that are registered as being small, 12% work in medium-sized companies, and 41% work for large companies. So what we really see here is this kind of complete disjoint between the number of firms and the power of firms in terms of turnover and hiring ability. These 15% here are essentially kind of sole traders. These are companies where there's only a single owner who don't hire any additional employees. So 99% of UK companies are small. They account for 46% of employment and 36% of turnover. All SMEs together account for 99.9% of the businesses and around half of the turnover. But then the flip side of that is that if we look at large companies, very, very few of the companies are large, and yet they constitute around 50% of turnover and 40% of employees. If your objective for policy is to help companies grow and prosper, then startups are a very bad way of doing that. There's a number of reasons why startups may be a good idea and why it's important that we have policies that help small and medium-sized enterprises. But just notice that when we're gearing ourselves towards the SME sector, if our real goal is turnover and employees, if we want job growth and if we want economic power, then that comes from the very, very, very small number of large companies. Now, in terms of theories of a firm, this originates from a comparative institution approach. So economists only really began to study firms and organizations in the 1970s. The 1970s was when industrial organization as a sub-discipline really came into its own, and when economists spent time studying firm composition and organizational behavior. To some extent, this originates from the socialist calculation debate. Now, this took place at the turn of the century, and this is the perennial debate in economics about capitalism versus socialism. Before the 1970s, there was this very rich debate about communism as opposed to capitalism, about socialism. In other words, the debate about rival economic systems at a country level was incredibly rich, but very little was done within organizations. Now that's interesting because if we think about socialism as being a hierarchical organizational system and capitalism as a market-based system, we had that debate at a social level when we were thinking about different countries, but economists seem to entirely neglect the issue of hierarchies within capitalist systems. So if we think about a firm as a hierarchical structure, then the fact that they exist within a capitalist system was neglected. It was almost as though capitalism beat socialism and the implication is markets beat hierarchy. But then this interesting question emerges, which is, well, then why in market systems do we have so many little hierarchies and in some cases big hierarchies that are operating within that system? And it was only really the 1970s where economists began to kind of study the hierarchies within capitalist system. This was because of the work of Ronald Coase. So Ronald Coase was a British economist that made a number of incredibly important contributions. Perhaps most importantly, he pioneered the transaction cost approach to economics, which is very informative when looking at firms. The big question that Coase asked was, if markets are so efficient, why do firms exist? Interestingly, he asked this question to people who ran organizations. So this is a really nice example of an economist that engaged in empirical adventurism. He toured America talking to CEOs to try and learn more about how companies operated and to try and answer this research question that he had. This is published in his famous work, The Nature of the Firm, where he talks about the concept of transaction costs. These are defined as the cost of using the price mechanism. So Coase pointed out that it's costly to use the price mechanism. It's costly to find trading partners. It's costly to engage in the act of trade. He suggested that we should compare the costs associated with markets with the costs associated with hierarchy. So put simply, he said, it's not free to use the market, so we need to understand the costs associated with markets and then compare those with the costs associated with hierarchy. And as a typical economist would say, people will use whichever system has the lowest costs. In terms of a firm setting, this tells us some important things about team production. We can essentially define a firm as a centralized contractual agent in a team production. So a company is a centralized contractual agent within team production. In many circumstances, it makes sense to produce within a team. The firm is the agent that sets up to be able to provide a centralized contractual service that enables that team to function. A team facilitates the use of joint inputs. It can be difficult to establish which members of the team are contributing what, and therefore it becomes very complex to understand what the returns should be for the individual team members, and the firm therefore brings those together. It rewards people jointly, and it also means that they have the benefit of being able to coordinate their resources in terms of inputs. This gave rise to what became known as the nexus of contract approach to the firm, where the firm is a nexus of contracts. We understand the firm's operations in terms of the contracts that are being written with respect to its employees and contractors and suppliers. Essentially, firms are just sets of market contracts. It's just the way in which we write contracts. It might be that employees don't want to have to find on any given day how much work they're going to have. People like to have some certainty around how much they'll be paid over the course of a year. It might be that people benefit from being able to do that. Managers like to be able to tell people what to do without having to negotiate individually over every single command. And so it makes sense to have a contract between the employer and the employee. It gives the employee a stable, more certain income. It gives the employer the ability to be able to use hierarchical mechanisms to get people to do what they need. And those contracts are essentially what helps us to define the firm. The concept of opportunism is also relevant here. One of the big problems with using contracts is that there is an element of opportunism. Whenever there's an agreement being made, once an agreement has formed, then there's a potential for people to try to renegotiate. The argument here is that firms are a way of reducing this potential for opportunism by binding people together coherently and contractually. So what we're getting at with the opportunism point here is that there is the moral hazard of post-contractual relations due to asset specificity. That sounds quite complicated, but what it's getting at here is that if you're involved in a supplier relationship, if somebody creates a whole bunch of inputs for your organization, once those inputs are made, you might be completely reliant on buying those from the firm that made them. The firm that made them may be completely reliant on you buying them because they don't have any market value with any other organization. And that gives us an incentive for both sides of the exchange to try and back out, to try and change the contract, to try and renegotiate. If those two organizations actually become part of the same firm, however, then you're minimizing that opportunism. So this really explains the concept of vertical integration very fluently. It talks about how it may well make sense to buy suppliers, to put that within the same organization, and it means that you have less scope for people to try and renegotiate. Coase was well aware of the fact that it was costly and time consuming to engage in contractual negotiations, and those contracts are subject to renegotiation. And so by putting everybody within a firm and contracting at a much broader level, then there's efficiency gains from that. Very simple example, just to kind of try and demonstrate that point. Imagine whether you're deciding whether to contract out to cleaners or employ them as members of staff. So if you're an organization, you have the opportunity to have your cleaners as employees, as full members of staff on your payroll, part of the organization, or you can outsource that and you can make contract payments to cleaners. The transaction cost approach says that one of the problems that you might face when you've outsourced it is that on any particular day, the cleaners may not be available. They may say that they have a particular job description, and if you need a specific task being done, it might fall outside of their remit. You might want them to come in on a particular day, but they may not be available to do it. You may want to slightly change what you need them to do. They may haggle over that, and it can become quite costly and time consuming to be able to do that. The bottom line of a firm is that by having people as employees, you can simply use your authority of command to be able to make instructions rather than trying to renegotiate whenever anything has to change. A transaction cost approach to the firm says that the evolution of organizations is best understood by the constant search for a decrease in transaction costs. So over time, when transaction costs change, it may be the case that it becomes easier to negotiate with outside agents. It may be that there's a cleaning company that does a very effective job at being able to provide cleaners on demand. Maybe they can have a lot more flexibility, and that will be a reason why you may move away from employing cleaners yourself to contracting them out. So as those transaction costs change, company strategy will change, and we can understand whether or not people outsource or bring people in, whether tasks are done within the organization or tasks are done outside of the organization, whether you're vertically integrating, whether you're selling off business units, whether the company is growing, whether the company is shrinking. All of those things can be understood in the sense that you are constantly trying to just decrease transaction costs. Now, an alternative to the transaction cost approach to the firm is what's called capabilities. Capabilities originates from Penrose's famous book in 1951, who's mentioned that firms possess capabilities, which are defined as the knowledge base of a firm. So a firm's capabilities are the knowledge that is possessed within the organization. Richardson built on this 1972, spoke about inter-firm cooperation via common capabilities. Next big contribution was Nelson and Winter in 1982. They spoke about capabilities as being a form of local or tacit knowledge. So local knowledge is knowledge that exists in a particular time and place. Tacit knowledge is knowledge that may not be articulated. So it's knowledge that we possess without really being able to explain what it is that we know. And that is the knowledge that exists within organizations. And a firm is simply a place where those capabilities exist. We can find evidence of capabilities oftentimes in routines. Some companies have better routines than others. But if you think about the way firms work, it may not always be something that you can articulate. There may be strong cultural elements. Sometimes you walk into an organization and you kind of get a feel that they're doing certain things in an effective way. And those capabilities will be what are defining the firm in this sense. So the firm is a localized learning system. If we take a capabilities view seriously, the firm is a system that learns. It's about long-term bidding relationships. They coordinate the knowledge that's possessed by the members. They are repositories for tacit knowledge, the knowledge that's contained amongst those employees. I think we can make a nice distinction here, whereby the transaction cost approach is a somewhat mechanical treatment of how firms respond to relative prices. It implies that whenever relative prices change, firms change their behavior based on a constant seeking out of lower transaction costs. This is an economist's view of how organizations tend to evolve, whereby everything can be explained by a change in external factors and external relative prices. By contrast, the capabilities approach looks much more deeply at what we can think of as softer concepts, such as the internal processes and the knowledge generation. Personally, I think both of these approaches are very useful. I don't think that we have to choose one or the other. I think that we can make distinctions between them, and there are circumstances where transaction costs and capabilities will provide different implications, and they won't both be necessarily correct. But generally speaking, at our level now, I think both of these have important insights and help us to understand how firms operate. What I want to do, though, is I want to go a little bit deeper into the concept of entrepreneurship and say that while the economic literature focuses very much on transaction costs and capabilities, there's some concepts from entrepreneurship that I think are relevant and help to also build a fairly unique and distinctive theory of the firm. In particular, I'm going to just briefly go over 5 different elements that I think have an important insight into how we view organizations. So this is thinking about managerialism. It's about epistemics, i.e. the kind of thought process of the people who are participating, the capital structure, what we think of the Hayekian knowledge problem, and then also this issue of spontaneous order. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm just going to explain these 5 concepts and what they mean and why I think they're relevant. So managerialism simply says that firms go beyond having positions of management, and there's a distinction between entrepreneurship and management. As Mises said, a manager is a junior partner of the entrepreneur, no matter what the contractual and financial terms of his employment are. The only relevant thing is that his own financial interests force him to attend to the best of his abilities to the entrepreneurial functions which are assigned to him within a limited and precisely determined sphere of action. The managerial function is always subservient to the entrepreneurial function. So the entrepreneur is the person that has the business idea. They can then hire managers to help implement it. The manager is the person that implements the ideas, but there's this key distinction between what the entrepreneur is doing. Ludwig Lochmann made a similar distinction. He said entrepreneurs revise plans, the managers carry out plans. So thinking about who does the planning is very important. Organizations will be a mixture of the entrepreneurs and the managers. Now, in terms of epistemics, Nikolai Voss made this very important point whereby if you possess some kind of knowledge, maybe this is a hypothesis, maybe it's something that you believe very strongly, but it's something that you feel is a market opportunity. One thing you could do is to sell your service through a contract. Another thing you could do is to try to utilize it for arbitrage. But then another thing you could do is to start a firm. And so one of the reasons why firms exist is because it's not always possible to sell services through contracts or to utilize it for arbitrage by yourself. Ultimately, there's no market for entrepreneurs. There are markets for investors, but there's no market for entrepreneurs. There's markets for managers, but there's no market for entrepreneurs. And it's hard to transfer knowledge interpersonally. So sometimes we simply can't convince other people of the vision that we have. The fact that we live in a world of asymmetric information makes it hard to convince people. The fact that we live in a world of subjectivism makes it hard to persuade people. So what you can do instead is you can think about how much money you would make if you simply took a normal job versus the expected return that you would make from setting up your own venture. Entrepreneurs therefore can start their own firms and use employment contracts to convince others to join their enterprise. So if people don't understand or believe in your business idea, that's okay. You can hire them and pay them a wage, and then they'll be acting as if they believe it regardless. Now this is looking at one ways in which we would expect startups to have a very close link to entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs are people that need to use the startup as a vehicle of putting their idea into action. It's not necessarily the case that all entrepreneurship involves startups, but we can see here the epistemic element of why it can be relevant. Ultimately, this implies that there's a clearing process between those who want to adhere somebody else's vision versus those who want other people to help put into practice their own vision. The next point I want to make is capital structure. So one way of looking at firms is that a firm is a collection of capital resources. Therefore, the growth of a firm is simply capital accumulation. So a firm grows as it accumulates capital. The survival of a firm depends on its ability to readjust its capital structure in response to changes in market conditions. As market conditions change, firms will need to involve themselves in a new production process. In doing so, they have to restructure the capital resources it has at its disposal, and that determines its ability to survive. The more complex your capital structure, the more vulnerable a firm will be. I think this brings into mind the notion of creative destruction, whereby if you have a highly specific, complicated capital structure, then if business conditions change and the products that you're making are no longer in demand, then it's very difficult and challenging as a business to overcome that. It means that you're very, very vulnerable. Of course, if you have a very simple capital structure, then it's less likely that you're creating the products and services that have high value. So ultimately, the purpose of a firm is to be able to work out the appropriate capital structure that means you can capitalize on market demand whilst not being overly vulnerable. The capital value is the perceived value of a particular production plan. So we can define a firm as having as being a collection of capital resources. The value of the firm, therefore, is the perceived value of the particular production plan. And this is interesting because it demonstrates why when some companies go bankrupt and the resources within the firm are moved to other organizations, we can have dramatically different valuations of those assets depending on which use they're being put to. One of the chief difficulties of being an entrepreneur within an organization is being able to understand that the value of an asset is a function of its use, and therefore if you change the use of the asset, you're changing the value, not just of that asset, but also the entire organization. Ultimately, we're talking about the process of how capital valuations function within a market as opposed to the size of the capital stock. So it's not simply about measuring how much capital a company has, it's about really understanding how the assets fit into the vision of the organization and the products that it's trying to sell. Also important to note that when we talk about capital here, we're talking about capital goods. So we're talking about the means of production, we're talking about physical assets, we're not just talking about cash. In terms of the Hayekian knowledge problem, so this is the knowledge problem that's often attributed to F.A. Hayek. I think it may well be argued that Don Lavoie was the person who first really articulated the knowledge problem in these terms, but it's often attributed to Hayek. The point here is that the issue is not the allocation of known resources, rather the conditions for the discovery and assimilation of dispersed knowledge to actually create new knowledge. So the Hayekian knowledge problem is about how do firms create knowledge, and what are the conditions that are necessary to be able to discover new information. The ultimate reason why the socialist calculation debate was almost wrong-headed from the start was the assumption that market activity is all about allocating scarce resources and assuming that we already have those resources and we simply have an allocation problem which is deciding where they go. The economic problem is much deeper than that, knowing what to produce and knowing how to produce it. Ultimately, the economic problem is how do we create the mechanisms by which we can understand and generate the type of knowledge that we need to be able to solve those economic problems. And that's just as relevant within an organization. The problem in an organization is not so much about knowing what to do, but it's about creating the capabilities to be able to understand what we need to do. And then the final point I want to make in terms of an entrepreneurial firm is this concept of spontaneous order. Now, in this matrix, we've got a distinction between action and design. We've got design. These are things that are either human or not human designed. action is either human action or not human action. So if we just think, first of all, nice and simply, at this example here of sweeping a floor, when I sweep a floor, this is a human designed action, and it's a human engaged action as well. So I have the vision, I know what I'm trying to achieve, the design is in my head, and the action is coming from my body. So sweeping a floor is something that's of human design and of human action as well. Now there are some things that humans design, but is not part of human action. So the example I'm using here is a physics experiment. We can set up a physics experiment, it's designed by a human, and then we may be observing how things change, but there's no human action involved in that. There are things that are not human action and not part of human design. So the weather, for example, if it's raining, there's no human involvement in that whatsoever. There's no human action. It's not designed by a human. Now, I guess to some extent this makes us into difficult territory. There may be some climate change concerns that the rain, may be a function of human action, and that would be something that's a very important part of the climate change debate. Deliberately, though, I'm not talking about the weather generally. I'm talking about a specific thing such as rain on a particular day, which is not of human action and not of human design. Now, when we think about firms and an entrepreneurial firm, what we're looking at is this third category here. These are things that are of human action but not of human design. In economics, we call these the spontaneous order. It's something that humans are involved in generating, but they don't fit to the plans of any individual human. So if we think about language, for example, language is a really nice example of a spontaneous order. It emerges out of the way in which we choose to speak to each other, but it's not designed centrally. There's no central plan for how we speak. When we look at how dictionaries change over time, there's obviously efforts to try and document and codify language. There's obviously rules of grammar, and there's a debate over the extent to which those rules of grammar are inherent or not. But when I talk to my kids and I hear, the terminologies that they're using, the slang terms that they adopt, it's very clear that that's an organic process, whereby they're creating essentially their own language and how that interplays with the language that we all know as well. Money is also another good example of spontaneous order. Money, what constitutes money historically, is a consequence of people's choice as to what they wish to use in exchange. So there's an element of human action there. But historically, it wasn't the case that there was somebody designing a money. They weren't saying this is the money that should be used. Money was just something that would spontaneously emerge out of the market interactions that people had. As a macroeconomist, I have an interest in thinking about digital technologies and new money. We can think about cryptocurrencies, and there's talk about central banks wanting to create their own cryptocurrencies. One of the reasons why I find that such an interesting debate is because those central bankers are trying to engage human design in something that's fundamentally a spontaneous order, and that creates an interesting tension if central bankers are trying to create and design something that historically has been something that's not been designed by anybody, and has arguably emerged as an effective tool precisely because it wasn't designed by any individual. So when we're talking about a firm, we can see this as well. We can think of many firms as being a type of spontaneous order. Is the CEO designing how people respond within the organization, or are they simply setting up some kind of generalized rules, and then the culture of that organization is something that is an emergent phenomena that comes from those. The point here is whether or not agents follow general rules of conduct within a certain framework, or whether they're participating in a specific course of action. And many organizations possibly overestimate how much of what they do is designed, and underestimate how much of it is just a spontaneous order that follows from those general rules of conduct. So when we're thinking about firms, we have a transaction cost approach and a capabilities approach that you'll find a lot in the economic literature. But I also think there's those 5 elements of an entrepreneurial firm that are relevant to think about so that we have a really nice, full and complete picture.